Welcome, listeners, to Snippit Sports Science Podcast, sponsored by EliteForm.com and supported by listeners like you on the crowdfunding platform Patreon.com. Joined today by Chris Gaviglio. How are you doing, Chris?
Very well, thank you. How are you, Jared?
Pretty well. We've got a paper here titled, How Much Protein Can the Body Use in a Single Meal for Muscle Building? Implications for Daily Protein Distribution. And this was written by Jon Schoenfeld and Aragon. So I'm sure a lot of the listeners have heard of those two. They do a lot of research and they're quite popular on fitness science forums and whatnot. So they're well known and they've done a lot of research and very good quality research. What did you think of this study, Chris?
As the background alludes to, it's actually a really great introduction. And I know that we all think about what's the maximum amount of protein that can be utilized for lean tissue building purposes in a single meal. And there's also been that long-held misconception in the lay public that there's a limit to how much protein can be absorbed by the body. From a nutritional standpoint, the term absorption describes the passage of nutrients from the gut into the systemic circulation. And based on this definition, the amount of protein that can be absorbed is virtually unlimited. Following digestions of a protein source, the constituent amino acids are transported through the enterocytes into the intestinal wall, enter the hepatic portal circulation, and amino acids that are not utilized directly by the liver then enter the bloodstream, after which almost all the amino acids ingested become available for use by the tissues. While absorption is not a limiting factor with respect to the whole proteins, there may be issues with consumption of individual free-form amino acids in this regard. And specifically, evidence shows the potential for competition at the intestinal wall, with amino acids that are present in the highest concentration absorbed at the expense of those that are less concentrated. So that's a little bit of background, but I think what it's good here is that, once again, I'm probably the same here. It's like we all get thrown to say there's only so much that you can absorb, and therefore that's only so much that you should actually consume, and any more than that is a waste of time and money. When they look at how much protein you should actually consume, typically you look at an intake of around 20 to 25 grams of a high quality protein. And this is consistent with the muscleful concept. So anything above this amount is believed to be oxidized for energy or transaminated to form alternative bodily compounds. That gives you the background. And from this, the purpose of the paper was twofold. Firstly, they wanted to objectively review the literature in an effort to determine an upper anabolic threshold for per meal protein intake. And secondly, to draw relevant conclusions based on the current data so as to elucidate guidelines for per meal daily protein distribution to optimize lean tissue accretion.
I think a lot of these misconceptions that the general public have, absorption, detox, that sort of stuff, a lot of it is really just based around semantics. And I don't think that they're things that the general public actually care about, that whether or not they're using these words correctly. And as researchers, we might get a little muddled up on the specific semantics of it. But at the end of the day, detoxing sort of stuff, people only care if whether or not they're at risk for cancer. They don't care if the liver is really the detoxifier or if it's something else that could be benefiting their health. The same way that they don't really care if protein is being absorbed across the intestinal wall. They care if their muscles are getting bigger.
And I think everyone just wants the plug and play option. Have this, right. Do this, and you're going to get this result. Without truly understanding, as you said, the semantics behind how things work.
All right, and so the researchers go into several different studies here, looking at both sides of the argument that are there limits, are there not limits, and they go through quite a bit of studies. But the first one here, which I'm sure almost all the listeners will be familiar with, I know I've seen this study a lot, is one by Aragon and colleagues. And basically what they did is they had 3 different conditions where they took a total of 80 grams of protein and they split that into 3 different groups. The first one where they did 8 servings of 10 grams, one where they did 4 servings of 20 grams, and one where they had 2 servings of 40 grams. So I think this study might be familiar to a lot of people. It's very famous, very highly cited study that sort of launched this entire debate around protein dosing. And what that study found was that they had the best protein synthesis results for that 4 by 20 grams. And that's where a lot of that original 20 gram number came from, was this study that had a limited total of 80 grams. And we have to recognize that 80 grams of protein is not a lot overall and does not reflect, I believe they use the word the phrase ecological validity in the study here is that when we're looking at these studies, looking at protein intake, I think we strongly need to take into account how much protein would people actually consume. And almost no one is only going to be consuming 80 grams of protein across a 12-hour period.
And when you think about this, according to the study, it actually corresponded to less than 1 gram per kilogram of body mass.
Yeah, I think most people who are lifting are easily consuming 2 to 4 times that amount. So by limiting the dosing to a total of 80 grams, it doesn't have that ecological validity that we're talking about. It's also important to note that they just used whey protein, whereas the majority of protein that most people are consuming is going to be in mixed meals, or casein has now gained a lot of popularity. Whey is quite exceptional. It's a very odd type of protein in how quickly absorbing it is. So it's very rapidly absorbed through the intestine, and then it would be the most likely of any type of protein to have further oxidation. So it appears here they write that the absorption rate for whey as a fast-acting protein is about 2 grams per hour. So if you're having a 20-gram dose, that's going to be absorbed within 2 hours. Whereas an omelet, I think what many of us have for breakfast, my typical breakfast, containing the same 20 grams of protein, be about 3-egg omelet. That's about, I think, what a lot of us have. That is absorbed at a rate of 3 grams per hour. And so will be in your system for much longer than whey protein would. And by having a much more distributed pattern of the amino acids in your bloodstream, it would very likely have attenuated oxidation of those amino acids.
And also, if I'm correct here, it also promote greater whole body net positive protein balance. And this is the important caveat that these findings are specific to that whole body protein balance, isn't it?
Right. And I think that's a lot of the debate around when people are looking at acute studies for building muscle and just such massive limitations is we take very reductionist approaches to looking at building protein, building muscle, because most of it is just on this protein synthesis measure and doesn't take into account muscle-specific protein synthesis or protein breakdown.
In this section here, their final point was around the implication is that accompanying macronutrients potential to alter digestion rates do not necessarily translate to alterations in the anabolic effect of the protein feeding, at least in the case of the slow digesting proteins such as casein, as Jared was talking about earlier. More fat and or carbohydrate co-ingestion comparisons need to be made with other proteins, subject profiles, and relative proximity to training before drawing definitive conclusions around this concept. The second part of this paper they discussed was a potential of this concept of a higher acute anabolic ceiling than previously thought. To help explain this here, there was a study by McNaughton, and they employed a randomized double-blind within-subject design, where resistance-trained men participated in 2 trials separated by about 2 weeks. During one trial, the subjects received 20 grams of whey protein immediately after performing a total body resistance training bout. And during the other trial, the same protocol was instituted, but subjects received a 40-gram whey bolus following training. I don't know what the difference between bolus and whey protein is.
Oh, no. Bolus just means a lump, like a one big at one time. So instead of having a French lunch and eating over 2 hours, as opposed to smashing down a protein shake in a minute. And that vocabulary comes from the Areta study as well. So that's how pervasive that Areta study has been in this vocabulary that people have used for these subjects.
In this here, the results showed that the myofibrillar fractional synthetic rate was around 20% higher from consumption of the 40 grams compared to the 20-gram condition. And these researchers speculated that the large amount of muscle mass activated from the total body resistance training bout necessitated a greater demand for amino acids that was met by a higher exogenous protein consumption.
And this is much more the type of study that we're interested in because it's incorporating the greater demand for amino acids that training creates, which we would expect from most of the situations where we're interested in having a protein supplement is going to be around traditionally resistance training. And so this is much more ecologically valid what we're doing. But I think one thing that listeners need to think about a little bit is the cost effectiveness of their protein. So they might be thinking, okay, I can get 20% more if I have 40 grams as opposed to 20 grams. but you're spending twice as much money on 40 grams of protein to get 20% returns at the law of diminishing returns, as we spoke about previously. And so it's an important consideration that you may be already getting enough protein for the marginal gains that any additional protein would really get you. Then we see a few more studies that are a little bit more in line with the type of research that we would like to see. So we have Kim and colleagues here who endeavored to investigate this topic by provision of either 40 or 70 grams of beef protein consumed as part of a mixed meal on 2 distinct occasions separated by a 1-week washout period. They showed that there was a significantly greater whole body anabolic response, which was primarily attributed to a greater attenuation of protein breakdown. So this is a study that's not just looking at that protein synthesis, but is also taking into account that protein breakdown. And that's what I've seen in a lot of previous studies, is although we may maximize our synthesis at a relatively lower dose, the breakdown can still be inhibited at higher doses of protein.
I'm assuming from that last study, that's why when people say, you got to eat a lot of red meat, you've just done a gym session. That's perhaps actually backing that point up.
Yeah, beef can be good. It's, it might be a little bit carcinogenic, but, it's got lots of iron, and if you're getting good quality beef, it can be reasonably healthy. So it's something to consider always if you do eat animals, obviously. So one of the things they discuss a bit here is because in mixed meals, we have that greatly delayed digestion and absorption, and so there's slower release of the amino acids into the circulation, and hence may have contributed to dose-dependent differences in the anabolic response to the protein intake. The next thing that they go into here when they're discussing whether there's a possibly higher maximum of that protein dose is, and I've heard a lot of people discuss this, is the higher insulin responses when considering the inclusion of a generous amount of carbohydrate, such as if you're having mixed meals, or maybe if you're having maltodextrin in there with your protein shake. And as well, protein on its own can be quite insulinogenic. And so I've heard a lot of people say, like, oh, you got to pump your insulin to get the amino acid pushed into the muscle cell. And I think it is important to note that insulin isn't necessarily anabolic. It does get classified as such, but it's actually anti-catabolic. So it's preventing breakdown, again, as we're discussing more about preventing that breakdown rather than increasing that synthesis. Insulin is more of an anti-catabolic signaling hormone. And we do need to consider that the effect of insulin elevations on net muscle protein balance plateaus at a pretty modest range, given evidence that a 45-gram dose of whey protein causes insulin to rise to levels sufficient to maximize net muscle protein balance. It would seem that the additional macronutrients consumed in the study by Kim and colleagues had little bearing on the results. So it's quite easy to max out your insulin response, and you don't need to be doing more to get more insulin. So if you're already taking 45 grams of whey, you're already getting your maximum insulin response possible. So there's no need to have 60 grams of maltodextrin. It's probably not doing you that much good. And in fact, if you're blasting your insulin in this way, you could very well be having detrimental health effects on yourself rather than very much benefiting your muscle mass.
And the third part on this paper is just around longitudinal findings. Really what this comes down to is that it's all good and well to have these acute findings, but it's really the longitudinal responses that we really want to be looking into, that we want to find if they've actually got association with that long-term muscular gains. And obviously this can only be answered by assessing the results of longitudinal studies that directly measure changes in lean mass with provisions of varying protein dosages, as well as proteins of varying speeds of digestion and absorption. Obviously, as we spoke about earlier, that all these dosages and the speeds of digestion and absorption and how we take it really have a massive difference in the response in our body. And these are things that we need to consider.
Yeah, this study, Wilburn and colleagues found no difference in lean mass gains after 8 weeks of pre- and post-resistance exercise supplementation with either whey or casein. Didn't matter. Similarly, a lack of between-group differences in lean mass gain was found by Faber and colleagues when comparing several different whey and casein protein ratios. So they looked at pure whey, which I think a lot of people do. They did 50-50 whey casein, which I've seen people do, and I have no idea why anyone does 50-50 whey casein, because you don't get the response profile from either the whey or the casein when you do it. I think a lot of people believe that when they have a combination of whey protein, they get that first initial blast of the whey, and then the casein keeps a long profile sort of continuation of that anabolic signaling. And that's not the case, because when you put the whey in with the casein, it breaks up the micellar structure. And so it's not going to be as slow absorbing as if you just have casein by itself. For anyone who is consuming whey and casein, I think it's better to have that whey, wait 30 minutes, and then have your casein, because that's probably the response profile that you're probably trying to get. And then the third condition they looked at was 20% whey, 80% casein, which is a reflection of the whey and casein protein found in milk. And the results are pretty equivocal. And they go into a lot of different patterns of intermittent fasting, pulse pattern, spread pattern, like all these different ways of consuming your protein. And at the end of the day, it doesn't look like it makes too much of a difference how you get it.
And for me, Jared, I just as you said there, one paper said one thing, it was, another paper said something else. There's all these different conditions, and I skipped to the conclusion, and for me that perhaps what epitomized the paper for me, in terms of the points here. So for example, firstly, the distinction needs to be made between acute meal challenges, comparing different protein amounts, including cereal feedings in the acute phase following resistance training, and the chronic meal feedings, comparing different protein distributions through the day and over the course of several weeks or even months. Longitudinal studies which examine body compositions. This hasn't consistently corroborated the results of acute studies examining muscle protein flux, and that's what we were trying to bring through there in that last point. Quantifying a maximum amount of protein per meal that can be utilised for muscle anabolism has been a challenging pursuit due to the multitudes of variables open for investigation. Perhaps the most comprehensive synthesis of findings in this area has been done by Morton et al., as we said earlier, who concluded that 0.4 grams per kilo per meal would optimally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. This was based on the addition of two standard deviations to their finding that 0.25 grams per kilogram per meal maximally stimulates muscle protein synthesis in young men. In line with this hypothesis, Moore, in another study, mentioned that the caveat that their findings were estimated means for maximizing muscle protein synthesis, and that dosing ceilings can be as high as approximately 0.6 grams per kilo for some older men and approximately 0.4 grams per kilogram for some younger men. Importantly, it's also to remember that these estimates are based on the sole provision of rapidly digesting protein source that would conceivably increase potential for the oxidation of amino acids when consumed in larger amounts. It would seem logical that a slower acting protein source, particularly when consumed in combination with other macronutrients, would delay absorption and thus enhance the utilization of the constituent amino acids. However, the practical implications of this phenomenon remain speculative and also questionable.
A recent meta-analysis on protein supplementation involving resistance trainees reported an upper 95% confidence interval of 2.2 grams per kilogram per day. Then, Bandigan and colleagues also showed an upper confidence interval of 2.2 grams per kilogram per day. So there seems to be a bit of agreement and consistency that the most protein you're really going to be benefiting from is that 2.2 grams per kilo per day. And that's probably in a fairly large resistance training, possibly older male, where that would become beneficial. For a smaller, non-training, female, younger athlete, well, non-athlete, then that 2.2 grams per kilogram per day would really not apply, and there would be a much smaller protein requirement for that person. It's therefore a relatively simple and elegant solution to consume protein at a target intake of 0.4 grams per kilogram per meal across a minimum of 4 meals in order to reach a minimum of 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. If you're really gung-ho about your protein consumption, go ahead on up to that 2.2 grams per kilo per day. If indeed the primary goal is to build muscle, using the upper confidence interval daily intake of 2.2 grams per kilogram per day over the same 4 meals would necessitate a maximum of 0.55 grams per kilogram per meal. This tactic would apply what is currently known to maximize acute anabolic responses as well as chronic anabolic adaptations. While research shows that consumption of higher protein doses, which is greater than 20 grams, results in greater amino acid oxidation, evidence indicates that this is not the fate for all the additional ingested amino acids, as some are utilized for tissue building purposes.
Thanks for that, Jared. That really summarizes nicely in the paper here. For me, it actually said earlier that they had some concluding thoughts. One thing, when I was actually reading it, and I've seen some other papers, they actually have almost bullet points at the end of each section. And perhaps for me, some real simple bullet points would have really value added to this paper. It was really equivocal. It depends. But by the end there, in that conclusion, they really started to get to the bulk of the paper. Your thoughts on that, Jared?
Yeah, in the same line as the bullet points, I would have liked, a little bit more visual aid in the paper. I know that obviously for the listeners, they don't care, but as us, the ones who are trying to read it and look at it and go through it, I would have appreciated, some sort of dose-response curve plotted into the paper, some sort of figure, or maybe a table listing all the studies that they went through, because it was such a large bulk of studies, and going through each and every one of them, that's previous on it. So obviously this is a great comprehensive paper. They've really looked into it and tried to find the best conclusion that they could for the readers and the listeners. But maybe could have been a little bit more digestible.
No pun intended. Well, thanks for your time there, Jared.
Oh, thank you, Chris. Thank you, listeners. This has been Snippit Sports Science. See you all next week.